Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to February's Fireside Chat in honor of National Cancer Prevention Month. I'm Momna Hussein, the Community Outreach and Engagement Manager at the Masonic Cancer Center, and I will be your moderator today. So the Fireside Chats are brought to you by the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement at the Masonic Cancer Center at the University of Minnesota. The Office of Community Outreach and Engagement serves as a vital bridge between the cancer centers and community across the state of Minnesota and beyond. Our dedicated, small but mighty team is committed to reducing the burden of cancer by actively engaging communities and providing access to relevant knowledge on the latest in cancer research, prevention strategies, the importance of screening and early detection, treatment options, survivorship, and opportunities for clinical research. So today's Fireside Chat focuses on environmental exposures and their impact on cancer risk and prevention. Many of us think about cancer risk in terms of genetics or lifestyle changes, but the environments we live, work, and play in also play a significant role in shaping our health. From the air that we breathe to the water that we drink, environmental exposures can increase cancer risk, often in ways that we may not immediately recognize. So today's session will explore how cutting-edge research at the university is helping us better understand these risks and how this knowledge is shaping public health policies, community interventions, and personal actions that can help reduce cancer disparities. Yes, I'm going to say that word because the work doesn't stop. To guide us through this important discussion, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Irina Stepanov as our guest speaker today. Dr. Stepanov is a distinguished McKnight University professor and a Mayo professor in public health within the Division of Environmental Health Sciences at the University of Minnesota. She earned both her undergraduate and PhD degrees in chemistry from Moldova State University in the Republic of Moldova. As a leading researcher at the University of Minnesota Masonic Cancer Center and the director of the Institute for Global Cancer Prevention Research, also at the university, Dr. Stepanov's work focuses on understanding how environmental exposures contribute to cancer risk. By studying biomarkers of exposure, harm, and susceptibility, her research bridges the laboratory science and the community-based studies to establish direct links between environmental exposures and their biological effects. Her work not only identifies individuals who may be more vulnerable to these exposures, but also informs public education and policy efforts to reduce cancer risk. So we are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Stepanov share her expertise with us today. Dr. Stepanov, welcome and thank you for being here. But before we dive in, I'll just cover a few quick housekeeping items. So today's Fireside Chat will be recorded as they always are, and then the recording will post to the Masonic Cancer Center's YouTube page for you to rewatch or to share widely. For University of Minnesota employees and spouses participating in the university's employee well-being program, you can earn 200 well-being points for attending today by completing the form that will be linked in the chat shortly. And then just please make sure you're using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions or comments that you have throughout the session today. We have time carved out at the end for a moderated Q&A session with Dr. Stepanov. All right, now without further ado, Dr. Stepanov, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Amna. Thank you for this very generous introduction and for the invitation to be part of this Fireside Chat. I just want to kind of start by noting that I could probably talk for whole week about what we are doing, our research, both my research and also in the Masonic Cancer Center that our colleagues are doing on cancer prevention. So I just prepared more or less general overview of environmental exposures and cancer risk. And I will be happy to talk to anyone who will be interested to learn more about what we are doing at the Cancer Center. So I will share my screen. I hope you can see it.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. So just to start, I want to, again, Amna did a really great job providing an overview of my research expertise, but this is just a really general summary. So what we do in my research group, we are focused on characterizing the links between what is in environmental sources of exposure, with primary focus on tobacco and air pollution, and looking how these exposures translate into health outcomes. And we use biomarkers, which are metabolites of cancer-causing chemicals in blood, in urine. We look at DNA modifications caused by these chemicals. And we also use some other innovative tools, analytical chemistry tools, to understand what the concentrations and the types of chemicals that people are exposed to. So today I will cover, as I said earlier, just some general concepts about how chemicals cause cancer, some examples of environmental exposures that can increase cancer risk. I will discuss disparities, who is vulnerable to, most susceptible to exposures and cancer risk, and also what can be done to reduce carcinogenic exposures. So when we think about chemicals, cancer-causing substances in environmental sources, these are just some examples. So there are organic compounds, volatile toxicants such as acetaldehyde and formaldehyde. Many of you probably have heard of these chemicals. For example, acetaldehyde is a product of, can be generated from combustion sources, for example, from cigarette smoke, or exhaust, but also can be formed as a result of alcohol metabolism. So exposure to acetaldehyde has been linked to cancers in upper aerodigestive tract, but also liver and colon. Similarly, formaldehyde has similar sources of exposure. It is present in quite high levels, not only in cigarette smoke, but also in e-cigarette aerosols, which causes some concerns about the potential long-term effects of these products. And it is also a carcinogen, has been linked to nasal cancer as well as leukemia. And there are some other examples in this table, such as cadmium and some other metals. Again, you can see that combustion is one of the primary sources of many of these cancer-causing chemicals. That is why tobacco use is one of key sources to many cancer-causing chemicals, both direct mainstream exposure, but also secondhand exposure. But air pollution, particularly with recent wildfires, more or less recent, due to climate change. So these exposures are also quite similar to what people are exposed to when they smoke cigarettes. It's the same, very similar chemistry, a lot of overlap with, of course, some unique chemical profiles depending on what specifically is burned. So in addition to these chemical exposures from in air pollution, in other environmental sources, other key exposures that we need to remember are, for example, radon and other ionizing radiation. Radon is a big big problem in Minnesota, where levels of exposure are much higher than national averages. And it is known to cause lung cancer and other types of cancers. And of course, viruses and bacteria, which are transferred primarily from person to person by contact. And some of these viruses are associated with different types of cancer. And most prominent examples are liver cancer from hepatitis B and C, as well as cervical cancer from HPV. So as chemists, my background is in chemistry. We are really focused on particularly on chemical exposures, and how these exposures cause macromolecular alterations and put people at risk for cancer. And this is a chemical carcinogenesis paradigm that is really, I hope, informative in terms of explaining how chemical exposures lead to cancer development. So chemicals that are present, for example, in air pollution or in cigarette smoke, once people inhale or get them in the body, they can be metabolized to reactive electrophiles, reactive molecules that can bind to DNA and cause modifications to DNA structure. And if these modifications are repaired, you get back normal DNA. But if there is persistence of these modifications, when DNA is replicated, these modifications can trigger mutations, cause mutations, and that can lead to cancer. So this is a chemical carcinogenesis paradigm. Just to provide a little bit more context, what we mean that mutations lead to cancer. So these modifications in DNA, as I mentioned, when DNA is replicated, if it would copy the wrong sequence in DNA, and then mutated RNA that is responsible for copying sequences from DNA and synthesizing proteins, it can produce either no proteins if sequence is completely wrong, or it can generate too much of a protein, or maybe some kind of modified form that is not capable of functioning properly, or there could be that this modification in the sequence is not meaningful enough to cause changes to protein structure. So when protein amount or structure are modified, that can lead to disturbance of normal cellular processes, especially if these proteins are responsible for cellular functions related to cancer, such as tumor suppressor proteins or other oncogenes, oncoproteins. So in this way, original exposure by damaging DNA and causing mutations can lead to cancer. Of course, it's important to remember that we have our bodies are really amazing machines that have protective mechanisms, and this includes detoxification. So carcinogens, they are metabolized to water-soluble metabolites that can be removed with urine. For example, we also have some natural antioxidants that can trap inflammatory molecules that are caused by some harmful environmental exposures. Of course, there are DNA repair mechanisms that remove those DNA modifications caused by environmental chemicals. We also have cellular mechanisms in place that control cell cycle and encode program death, such as apoptosis. And immune system mechanisms are also in place. So in theory, any damage that is caused by a chemical carcinogen could be fixed, could be removed. But the problem is when exposure actually overweighs or overwhelms these protective mechanisms, or sometimes people just maybe get modifications in the same genes that are responsible for protection of cells from harmful effects of environmental toxins and carcinogens. So it is this fine balance between genetic predisposition and environmental exposures. And I also want to emphasize that while genetic makeup that determines how we respond to environmental exposures is really important, but over 90% of the risk is actually explained by exposure itself. In other words, exposure needs to happen first, and then our genetics defines how we deal with it. So the dose, the presence of exposure is a major factor that puts people at risk. So when we talk about environmental exposures, what is environment? They can be external factors such as sunlight, chemical pollutants, diet, social interactions, but it can also be internal factors such as metabolism, as I mentioned earlier, but also stress. Psychosocial stress is an important exposure that could enhance the negative effects of chemical carcinogen exposures. In fact, stress is an inflammatory agent, and it could contribute to supplying tumor-promoting molecules and move the carcinogenesis process towards development of cancer. So it's important to remember that it's not just the chemicals and physical agents, it's also the total environment in which we live, including psychosocial and socio-demographic factors. So if we think about the major sources of chemical carcinogens, tobacco use and secondhand smoke exposure, as I mentioned earlier, is a really a major source. Fortunately, we have some policies in place that protect people from exposure to secondhand smoke. But it is not absolutely absent because we still have certain population subgroups where smoking prevalence is high and secondhand smoke exposures are also high. Indoor and outdoor air pollution is another major contributor to carcinogenic exposures. There are many places in the world I do work globally. So, for example, in Thailand and in India, where I work with some other collaborators from the University of Minnesota, levels of air pollution can be extremely high. And as you know, now we can see some of similar levels of air pollution here in US due to wildfires that are happening in California and Canada and elsewhere. So this is an example of a problem that would benefit from addressing on a global scale, collaborating with researchers in other countries so we can better understand what those high levels of exposure to air pollution, to products of combustion, of organic matter, what does it mean, how it affects our cells, how it affects health outcomes, and how can we do something about it, moderate these exposures and monitor them. And of course, occupational exposures, probably one of the major sources of exposure to high levels of toxicants and carcinogens. Of all these sources and risk factors that contribute to cancer risk in populations, some are modifiable. Some can be modified by changes in individual behaviors. For example, tobacco smoking contributes to up to 20% of all cancer cases in U.S. Excess body weight, alcohol consumption, exposure to sun without protection, without using sunscreens, poor diet, and infections, as I mentioned earlier, as well as lack of physical activity. So all these factors are, in theory, are modifiable by engaging in or changing individual behaviors. So if we think about how you could reduce your risk for cancer, if you wanted to start today, if you don't practice these behaviors already, avoiding commercial tobacco would be one of the major ways to reduce exposures to cancer-causing chemicals. Eating healthy diet, not drinking alcohol. So pretty much you can go down these risk factors and try to change your behaviors accordingly. However, not all of these risk factors are easy to implement, easy to modify by individual efforts alone. So there are prevalence of many of these risk factors is much higher in some populations. For example, those with lower income or medically underserved. And in addition to encouraging individual behavior change, there is also a need to create infrastructure and resources, but also using policies to change, to make it easier for people to have access to resources that are needed to reduce these exposures. In addition, something like tobacco is highly addictive, as many of you know. It contains nicotine. So just will alone is not sufficient to quit using tobacco. So there is a need for not only for effective interventions, but also policies that would prevent tobacco manufacturers from targeting certain population subgroups with advertisements and promotional giveaways in order to keep them addicted to tobacco and continue using this product. So this is just one of the examples. So disparities in chemical carcinogen exposures do exist, and we cannot forget about it and cannot stop doing this work, as Amna said during the introduction. So there are a wide range of disparities in terms of smoking rates in populations with lower educational attainment, in certain racialized groups, as well as in people with lower income and other populations. There are also disparities in occupational exposures. For example, this table shows that any occupational exposure to occupational exposure to cancer-causing and harmful chemicals is higher in African American occupationally exposed individuals than in whites. And that includes any exposure and specific sources such as chemical plastics or painting, and other sources. And of course, lung cancer diagnosis is also higher in this population. Air pollution also is really concentrated in urban areas, in areas where certain population subgroups seem to their higher percentage of certain populations live. For example, benzene or asbestos, radon, arsenic, lead, different metals are commonly encountered in air pollution and environmental sources. And some people are exposed to these harmful chemicals, not only from individual behaviors, but also in places where they live, where they work and play. So some of the contributions to this higher level of exposure could be people live close to highways, for example, and they have higher level of exposure to exhaust fumes that are full of these cancer-causing chemicals. I hope I made a case for that exposures to environmental cancer-causing chemicals is not just a matter of changing individual behaviors, but it is also a matter of policies, creating policies that can provide measures to reduce actual levels of toxicants and carcinogens in the environment, in those environments where people who are more susceptible to these exposures live. I probably should have switched the slide earlier. So this is what the statement that I wanted to make. And what are those policies in cancer control and addressing inequities? These are just some examples. They include, for example, marketing restrictions for unhealthy foods and drinks. It could be marketing restrictions or sale restrictions for tobacco products that are often target communities with low socioeconomic status and also vulnerable age groups such as teenagers. It could be fiscal and legal tools, for example, taxes on, again, increasing taxes on unhealthy foods and tobacco products. Could be policies to increase access to green spaces, and to walking or cycling infrastructure. So these are just some examples that of policies that can be implemented. And research is key to informing these policies and to monitoring their effectiveness, because these policies need to be based on scientific evidence that they work, and then have tools to actually monitor and understand how these policies work in a particular situation, in a particular location and with a specific population. So research is really important in not only communicating to individuals about cancer risk factors, but also informing policies. I want to give a shout out to our tobacco research community at the University of Minnesota. We have this long-standing world-class expertise in tobacco research. I have been very fortunate to join this community many years ago, and we have expertise here ranging from across the translational continuum of tobacco research, from analyzing, understanding what is in products themselves, in tobacco products, to understanding mechanisms of carcinogenesis, and developing unique biomarkers that allow us to understand not only exposures to chemicals from tobacco, but also biological effects such as DNA damage. We also have colleagues at the university who look at the mechanisms of addiction using animal models. We have this amazing capacity for conducting non-therapeutic clinical trials of tobacco use, more like interventional studies and also chemoprevention studies, and of course cessation and treatment. And all this community collaborates really closely, and we have several really impactful examples of how this research contributed to advancing policies, including clean air laws. Research that came from University of Minnesota showed that biomarkers specific to tobacco were present in people who did not smoke but were exposed to secondhand smoke. So this is one of the examples that really directly contributed to development of policy that eventually reduced exposures and saved many, many lives. We also, more recent examples include work that was led by Dorothy Hatsukami on showing that reduction of nicotine in tobacco products can actually reduce the addictiveness of cigarettes and lead to a reduction in the amount of smoking. And some people just lose interest in cigarettes and quit. And that work was at the foundation of the proposed rule by the US FDA to limit the amount of nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels. We also, I could bring other examples, but I probably would be talking about tobacco research for a week, not just for an hour. And I will not, you can see the names, so I will not be bringing specific examples and naming individuals, because everyone has who is here, and maybe some people who haven't been included in this slide have done really impactful work. So it's impossible to just mention all of them. Another point I wanted to make is that, and I actually made it earlier, that doing work globally, forming research partnerships for cancer prevention is really important, and it's not a charity exercise. It's a really mutually beneficial partnership that we need to continue to engage in. For example, at our Institute for Global Cancer Prevention Research, we are focused on enhancing research capacity for chemical carcinogenesis research in countries, in low and middle income countries that are often have really high levels of exposure to chemical carcinogens and really lacking local evidence to support cancer prevention and control measures. We are also engaging in fostering innovation through these collaborations. For example, finding ways to measure exposure in a less expensive way, in a faster way, to conduct studies a little bit more efficiently, because we are doing it in low resource settings, but also this innovation can be brought back home and used here in a more efficient way. And of course, translating what we discover into practices and policies is another important focus of what we do. So why we focus on low and middle income countries in this work is because there are global disparities in tobacco carcinogen exposure, not only in US, across different populations, but globally. Whole countries sometimes experience the highest burden of tobacco use. And this chart shows tobacco attributable deaths by country income group. And you can see that nearly 80% of all deaths from tobacco attributable diseases occur in low and middle income countries. So we work in India with a group of colleagues here at the University of Minnesota. My primary partner in this work is Samir Kariwala in medical school, but also other colleagues are involved. And we're focusing on India because there is an extremely high prevalence of smokeless tobacco use. There are a little over 300 million smokeless tobacco users in the world, and 222 million live in India. And rates of oral cancer are extremely high in India. So on one hand, if we can address the issue of smokeless tobacco use, which is the primary cause for head and neck cancer, oral cancer in India, if we can address this issue and reduce carcinogenic effects of smokeless tobacco in India, we can probably remove up to 70% of all oral cancer cases that occur globally. On the other hand, we have a lot to learn from India that we may need at some point to deal with here in the US. There is a large variability of smokeless tobacco product formulations that are used around the world. And among these, the majority of what is shown on this chart are actually used in India. So, we do have examples in the past where products that have been confined to certain geographical areas or certain cultures became suddenly extremely popular in the rest of the world, including in the US, and that would be hookah or shisha smoking. So we cannot rule out that some of these products that are highly popular in India will not eventually find their way to our use, to US, and could cause the same devastating health outcomes that they are causing in India. So understanding what is in these products and why they're so addictive and why they're so harmful would be really important, not only to inform tobacco control measures in India, but also to advance understanding of how tobacco causes cancer. So we just recently, it's just an example, we recently completed a study in India that was published just a few months ago. And we analyzed a large sample of tobacco products, 57 brands purchased in Mumbai. And what we found was that there was more than 2,500-fold variability in the levels of nicotine, free form of nicotine, which is that biologically available form of nicotine that is highly addictive. So more than 2,500-fold variability across these products, and more than 1,700-fold variability in the levels of nitrosamines. And nitrosamines are highly carcinogenic chemicals that are present in tobacco and are specific to tobacco. And they are believed to be responsible for causing oral cancer in people who use smokeless tobacco and also who smoke. So we found this extreme variability in the levels of these chemicals, and some of them are the highest that have ever been measured in any tobacco product in the world. So that shows that provides additional powerful evidence that by maybe introducing some regulation of tobacco products to reduce levels of these harmful chemicals could be an additional measure to reduce risk for cancer in people who are highly addicted to tobacco and for whom interventions do not work yet. So they still use product even if they are trying to quit. And it's not just the analysis of products themselves. When we looked at biomarkers of exposure to these cancer-causing nitrosamines, we saw that there was significant individual variability in levels of this urinary biomarker. And these are levels typically found in US people who smoke in the United States. So it's up to 100-fold higher levels of biomarkers in some people in India who use these highly contaminated products. We also do work on air pollution in India and, as I mentioned, in Thailand. And again, there are disparities, global disparities in air pollution exposure, with many countries having very high levels of exposure. So in India, we have a project where, again, we are not only helping to generate locally relevant data to inform local cancer prevention efforts, but also because levels of exposure are so high, we can learn from the environment in India in developing biomarkers and innovative tools to measure this air pollution, to hopefully address some of the issues that we are facing here, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, with these high levels of exposure from wildfires that we are facing here in the US. So it's bringing back home the notion of global collaboration. And I also wanted to give this kind of emphasize 10,000 families study that is going on here, led by investigators from the Masonic Cancer Center. If there is, I know they do an amazing job going around the state and recruiting families into this study. If there is anyone on this seminar who is not signed up yet, please reach out to them and consider enrolling into this study. For example, exposure to radon is one of key focus areas for this study. And you can learn a lot about how to reduce your exposures, how to determine whether or not you are exposed, and then how to remediate this exposure. And lastly, of course, there are always concerns about elevated cancer risks in community, and sometimes it can be very stressful, and scientists do not always have all the answers. Minnesota Department of Health provides these resources. There are very informative materials that they provide about how to, in addition to what I described, how to prevent your exposures to environmental carcinogens, but also they provide this contact information where you can reach out and share your concerns and learn about programs at the Department of Health that are focused on helping communities to stay healthy. So with that, I will stop and I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stepanov, for that extremely insightful and informative presentation. I mean, your research just provides such a critical perspective of how environmental exposures increase cancer risk. And I really appreciated the way that you broke down complex science into something that's accessible and actionable. And it also kind of showed just how much or how impactful the research that you do globally can have on public health and preventative efforts. So thank you for all the work that you do. So now we'll transition to our Q&A portion. So we would love to open the floor for our audience to participate. So this is the opportunity to engage directly with Dr. Stepanov. So please submit any comments or questions that you have, and we'll try to address them in the time that we have remaining. But it's not a fireside chat without getting our fire started. And so as folks start entering their questions, we'll get that fire started. Okay, so it looks like we've received quite a few thoughtful questions from our audience, so we can dive right in. So our first question here focuses on the timely issue that we hear a lot about in the news to be the long-term impacts of wildfires in the US, specifically what we've seen in California more recently. And, can we say that these environmental exposures can potentially increase cancer risk?
Yeah, this is a very good question and definitely a high level of concern because, as I mentioned earlier, the smoke from wildfires is highly toxic and contains very high levels of many chemicals that we know cause cancer. So it's not just an expectations that they may be harmful. There is enough evidence for these chemicals to be classified as carcinogenic to humans. So it's that, which means that there is mechanistic data from cell studies, from animal studies, and from human epidemiological studies to say that elevated exposures to these chemicals are associated with cancer risk. So it is definitely something that is being monitored. There are a lot of research groups that are focused on this, and state departments. But it's definitely a risk. And here is, one personal measure that I didn't mention. I think it's very helpful and important to keep an eye on air quality indices and actually follow recommendations. So if you don't have to be outside when air quality indices are extremely high, try not to go outside. Again, not everyone can afford it. People have to go to work. But if at all possible, that would be one of those ways to try to protect yourself from additional levels of exposure.
Okay, so actually following up on that, there's a question that was just submitted. So what methods and practices are there which allow individuals to assess their exposure and potentially change behavior?
Mm. Well, when it comes to actual uh, air pollution from wildfires, that would be one of the ways to assess whether or not you are exposed to whether or not air quality is really bad. Participating in studies that we conduct at University of Minnesota is a good way to learn more about exposures and how to protect yourself and good practices for personal prevention. Because usually we not only enroll people in the study to follow protocols that we ask them to follow, but we also provide explanation why we do this study, what does it mean, what we are looking for. And like with tobacco studies, we provide recommendations and resources and references to cessation, for example, after participants complete the study protocol. So these are just some thoughts on what could be done in addition to following just general recommended practices for reducing your exposures to cancer-causing chemicals.
Thank you for clarifying that. So there has been a question about just if there are unexpected factors that warrant our attention in such exposures such as mold and lead, and if there are any direct links that we should be aware of when it comes to these exposures.
Mm-hmm. So you said lead and mold?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so lead is definitely a concern for cancer. It is considered a probable human carcinogen. Exposures have been linked to cancer, kidney cancer, I believe, lung cancer, and potentially other cancers. So preventing exposure to lead would be important. There are some simple ways, like do not let dust to accumulate in cars, on surfaces that you have contact with, especially if you live close to highways and busy traffic areas. In terms of mold, there is no evidence that it can cause lung cancer or other types of cancer. However, mold can cause some respiratory problems, compromise immune system. So these processes, long-term chronic presence of these conditions could potentially increase susceptibility to cancer in people. So mold remediation would be important as well.
Thank you for breaking that down. So another question that was just submitted, sometimes there are news stories from China and often people on the street are wearing masks. Does this reduce or prevent the harmful effects of air pollution?
Well, I think it's a good question. As we learned during the COVID pandemic, is that it depends on the mask, right? So wearing masks could help to prevent from particles. And when we talk about particles in the air, it's not just the physical particle, which is harmful on its own if it gets into the lung, but also particle is composed of chemicals. And often these particles, they carry, not often, all the time, they carry metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and other chemical on their surfaces. So mask can prevent exposure to some of these particles, but not all. So there will be sufficiently small air pollution particles that would still penetrate through the mask, and individual molecules of air pollution contaminants can still cause elevated exposures when air quality is really bad.
Thanks for that. So we understand that risk factors are important. And again, there's questions that are coming up about just actions that folks can take. So what tangible steps can individuals take to ensure their voices are heard and their communities are protected? So how can individuals advocate for themselves when they are at risk for environmental exposures?
Yes, that's a good question, and I think it's partly why, not partly, this is why I had the additional reminder that we have Minnesota Department of Health, for example. So partnering with advocacy groups, community organizations that are focused on health-related issues, and also reaching out directly to the Department of Health to raise concerns and also learn about, what sometimes concerns can be alleviated by getting more information. So I would say researchers reach out to the Cancer Center. We have a lot of experts who could answer many questions and also facilitate, some potentially research or reaching out to policymakers and Minnesota Department of Health, and of course your local governments that have power to potentially change some of the practices that lead to exposures to carcinogens.
Thanks, Dr. Stepanov. I mean, that's such a great reminder how advocacy plays such a huge role in changing policy and promoting public health. So looks like we are gonna be out of time. So I'm really sorry that we couldn't get through all of the questions that were entered, but I guess we'll just kind of wrap up our Q&A with one practical question. And again, we're going to talk about action. So what is just the key takeaways, Dr. Stepanov, that you want our audience to take from our conversation today? So we'd just love to hear more about your actionable advice for our audience.
Well, definitely do your best to prevent, to address modifiable risk factors, and which is personal, behaviors when possible. Tobacco use, alcohol consumptions, using sunscreen. All these measures are really, they account for probably close to half, I think, according to WHO, around 40% of all cancers can be preventable by changing these behaviors. So that would be definitely the best way to reduce risks. Although it's not 100%, the preventable, but pretty close to 100%.
Well, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much, Dr. Stepanov, for sharing your expertise and for providing such practical advice. This has been just such an incredibly informative discussion, and we really appreciate your time and your insights. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our time, so thank you for joining and for engaging with us today. Your participation is key in spreading awareness and driving meaningful change. But before we go, we'd appreciate your feedback. At the end of this session, Zoom will populate a brief survey on your screen, so please take a few moments to complete it. Your responses not only help us improve future sessions, but you can also enter into a drawing to win a prize pack with goodies filled from the Masonic Cancer Center. And also, don't forget, mark your calendars for our next virtual fireside chat in honor of Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month on March 19th from 1 to 2 p.m. During that session, we'll hear from a medical oncologist and colorectal cancer survivor and advocate as they discuss advancements in colorectal cancer detection, screening, treatment, and the power of advocacy. So we hope to see you all there. And lastly, make make sure you follow the Masonic Cancer Center on all of our social media platforms to stay up to date on future announcements and events from the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement. Thank you again for joining us today, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to connecting with you at future events. Take care, everyone.